Welcome to this YouTube presentation by Public Interest Before Corporate Interests. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'll be talking about constitutional mayhem today. Now, a number of things are occurring in the next few weeks which are interesting, which obviously highlight the inadequacies of our constitution, not just in terms of there being minimal, if any, protections for the individual against the arbitrary exercise of state power, but the fact there is actually no protection for the community as a whole, that we are exposed to exploitation in a judicial sense and an economic sense because of the lack of protections for the Australian population in the Constitution. And 2 points highlight this over the last few weeks. One is the kerfuffle that's occurring now regarding Australia Post and the fact that the CEO of Australia Post thinks that Australia Post is a corporation and is running Australia Post like a corporation. Now, I don't care whether they give away Cartier watches courtesy of my taxes, and I don't particularly care what the CEO earns. But what I do care about is how the government of the day can subvert the economic and political and cultural and social future of this country to promote their own myopic vision of the world. Not only did the federal government put out a budget which actually highlighted private values, what's more important is they are in a position to stack boards of important institutions and judicial appointments in this country to reflect their own myopic views and assist and help their political friends, their friends in the corporate sector. And this is what we have seen. It's not a matter of the CEO of Australia Post doing what she was told to do to turn Australia Post into a corporation, although Australia Post theoretically belongs to the Australian people. What we are seeing is this federal government stacking boards across the country of every viable institution, public institution, whether it's the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, whether it's Australia Post, whether it's institutions which deal with entertainment and culture, and the list goes on and on. What we are seeing is the boards of these institutions being stacked by people who are only interested in maximising return to themselves as board members and maximising return to their friends in the corporate sector. They have a freeway, an 8-lane freeway to the Australian Treasury, and they are consistently robbing us blind because there are no constitutional protections. Not only do we find ourselves in a situation where they can rob us blind because they've built this 8-lane highway to the Australian Treasury and have pillaged the public sector by selling off hugely important, essential public infrastructure and public institutions like the Commonwealth Bank, Telstra, the Australian ports, Australian telecommunications, the Australian airports, and the list goes on and on. Electricity, gas in many states, because the Australian Constitution provides no protection to public institutions which are built up over decades of struggle by working men and women and other human beings in this country who have put in tens of millions of dollars to ensure that services are delivered to each and every one of us based on need, not based on the concept of creating profits for the private sector. What we have seen is that public assets do not belong to the Australian people. They belong to the government of the day. That's why the government of the day can sell institutions like the Commonwealth Bank, like telecom, like electricity, gas, ports, and the list goes on and on. They can sell these institutions at any time they like without having to go to the people in a referendum. So there's no constitutional protection for public assets. And even more importantly, they have absolute power to put people on the board who reflect their political ideology. And we are seeing this in terms of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and Australia Post. We see it consistently. We see it consistently where board members are appointed to line their pockets and turn public institutions into private organisations which make profits for the outside world, because there are no constitutional protections for any public institution. It gets worse with the legal system. Over the next 2 weeks, the Australian government, the Morrison-led coalition government, will be appointing 2 new judges to the High Court of Australia. That's 2 new judges out of 7. And these 2 new judges that will be appointed will not be appointed on the basis of their expertise, on the basis of their legal standing, but will be appointed on the basis of their conservative, reactionary, ideological positions. Because the government wants to nobble the High Court by appointing their own members. And it's only the government of the day which has the ability to appoint High Court judges. It appoints Federal Court judges. It appointments to the Fair Work Commission. Essential, important institutions which are changed for decades by the lifelong appointment of conservative, reactionary individuals to these positions. And there is no constitutional protection. There is no mechanism by which the Australian people can be involved in the appointment process of important judicial figures, especially figures who are appointed to the High Court, who determine what is and isn't constitutional in terms of the laws that are passed in this country. And we see it over and over again where appointments to the High Court make decisions which do not reflect what is going on in society today. So anybody who thinks that the Australian Constitution provides any protection, it provides less protection than a fig leaf on the Venus de Milo. It provides less protection. It provides no protection to the individual. No protection apart from the freedom of religion and possibly the right to vote. No freedom of speech, no protection in terms of the protection for the individual against the arbitrary exercise of state power. And what we've seen with the COVID-19 crisis across the country, both at the state and federal level, is how inadequate our constitutional protections are as far as the individual is concerned. With a stroke of a pen, rights and liberties which we think we have disappear. But more importantly, what we've seen over the last few weeks, and what we'll continue to see over the next few months, is how the government of the day can modify, change the direction of society long after they've been removed from office by the Australian people through judicial appointments to the High Court, to the Federal Court, to the Fair Work Commission. How those appointments are for life, and how those appointments, or to the age of 70, and how those appointments can stymie the will of the people through the election of a new government. And we see this over and over and over again. So judiciously, there is no protection, no constitutional protection for the Australian people. And then we come to the third tier. No individual protection, no judicial protection, no economic protection. What is a constitution in a sovereign nation state? A constitution should be the mechanism via which the wealth and power in this society is held, distributed and used. But it is not. In our society, in Australian society, economically, no public institution, irrespective of how old it is. The Commonwealth Bank was formed in 1911 and was sold in the mid-1980s. Irrespective of how important those institutions are to maintaining equity in the population, in the community. Irrespective of the economic benefit they provide to people in a continent like Australia. irrespective of many issues, it provides no protection. For example, we have the greatest mineral wealth in this country. 25 million people living on a continent, living on a resource-rich continent. And those resources have been given away for a peppercorn rent, for creating jobs, to a handful of corporations and individuals who are becoming multi-billionaires from exploiting our resources, while 1.2 million children in this country live below the poverty line. When you have a charity like the Smith family asking Australians to sponsor an Australian child because they cannot afford the basic necessities of life on a resource-rich continent like Australia, and there is no constitutional protection for the economic welfare of its citizens, you realise how bare this country is, how bare, how we are exposed to the state and the corporate sector without protection. No legal protection, no economic protection, no individual protection. And people carry on about the great Australian Constitution. All the Australian Constitution is nothing more than a trade agreement between states and the central government. It does not protect us economically. It does not protect us judiciously. It does not protect us in terms of our individual rights. And most importantly of all, it allows a government which is elected for 3 years to influence society for decades. Because every judicial appointment that is made to the age of 70. It allows governments to influence public institutions and change them from public institutions which are funded by the taxpayer, which provide services to the taxpayer, to private corporations which make profits for their major shareholders. It breaks down any protection we have in this country. And that is the dilemma of Australia. That is the dilemma. There are many other nation states across the globe that have constitutions which provide some individual protection, some economic protection, not no protections at all. So we have a major issue in this country. And to make matters worse, the Constitution is structured in such a way as to ensure there will never be any changes. Because the government of the day is the only organ which can actually put a question to the people in a constitution. It's only the government of the day that enjoys a majority of support in both houses of Parliament. And most constitutional questions have been rejected, not because of the conservatism of the Australian people, but because the Australian people have been concerned by the way those constitutional questions have been asked, because in the majority of cases they're there to reinforce the power of the state at the expense of the individual, at the expense of communities. The only way we can change this constitution is through a revolt or a revolution or a campaign to introduce citizens-initiated referendums in this country, where the citizens can bypass Parliament and put questions that are fundamental to the type of society we live in, fundamental to the welfare of the Australian people, that are fundamental to a secure future, can actually put these questions to the Australian people in Australian referendum through citizens-initiated referendums. And again, it's only both houses of Parliament, a majority in both houses of Parliament, which can put this question to the Australian people. And then a majority of electors and a majority of states need to support that question before it is incorporated into the Australian Constitution. No wonder less than 12% of all constitutional questions which have been put to the Australian people have been rejected, because people understand that Parliament uses referendums as a mechanism of reinforcing its power, its powers, at the expense of local communities and individuals. So we have major issues to look at. And if you think the Australian Constitution provides any protection, as I said before, it's less protection than a fig leaf on a nude picture. That's protection. And in the majority of cases, even that fig leaf will be blown away by the winds of change. That's the dilemma we face. So what can we do? Well, we can accept the situation and say that's the way it is. That's politics. It's got nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with me. Or we can actually be part of a wider social, cultural, political movement that wants to introduce major reforms to ensure that in this country, 25 million people living on a continent, nobody lives in poverty, that everybody's basic needs are met for a universal basic income, that we all are included in the decision-making processes. And that's why I encourage you to look at the Public Interest Before Corporate Interests website, pipsy.net. Join if you wish. If you don't want to join, that's fine. But at least do something in your own personal life, your political life, your social life, to ensure that the assumptions that this society is based on are questioned. The assumption that we live in a democratic society, the assumption that we live in an egalitarian community, the assumption that everybody has a fair go, the assumption that Indigenous Australians have been compensated for their losses. An assumption based on assumption based on assumption. And all we have to do is look at the history of this country, the history before Federation and the history after Federation, to understand that everything we enjoy today is not because of any so-called constitutional protections or because of laws that have been passed by Parliament. It is because people have struggled to force Parliament through political parties and social struggles to amend and change and introduce legislation to put their needs before the needs of the corporate sector, that small sectional society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. The ball's in your court. It's up to you. As an individual, I can do nothing. I can talk to you. As a small political party, we can do very little. But as a greater movement, we can make changes. All struggles start with the first step. Your first step should be joining public interest before corporate interest. This will give us the ability to influence the social, political, cultural debate in this country. It's no accident that most Australians don't even know they have a constitution, let alone understand that there are no individual protections for the individual against the arbitrary exercise of state power. There is no economic protection for the individual and communities and everybody on this continent constitutionally, and there are minimal, if any, judicial protections in our constitutional framework. So, as I said before, it's up to you. You've been listening to this this program or this YouTube presentation, and I encourage you to either give us a ring on 0439 395 489, get some information about Pipsy, or you can download the application form from Pipsy, info@pipsy.net. Look after yourself. Remember, it's not just the coronavirus pandemic you have to worry about. You have to worry about the corporate capitalist pandemic which has infected the Australian Constitution, the Australian government, and unfortunately many of our fellow citizens.